What is up, everybody? My name is Paul Mayer, and today I want to talk about wireless microphone systems, especially for DJs, but also for anybody else that is using a wireless system to transmit audio in sort of a live performance setting. So this also includes photographers or perhaps, bands. And the idea is this is sort of a very basic introduction to sort of how wireless works and kind of touches on two major points. The first being, how can I get increased performance out of my existing system? So let's say you're dealing with dropouts or other things like that. How can I, ensure that I get better performance out of that system? And number two, let's say you're considering upgrading to a new system or buying a system. What systems are out there, what to look for, and kind of in general, what recommendations do I have for those people kind of in that boat? And I know a lot of those people in the US, it says tax return season, so everyone got a check from Uncle Sam, hopefully, and they're wondering how to spend that money. I think wireless microphones are a very common purchase, especially with the FCC sort of outlawing certain frequencies to being used and people kind of being forced out of their old microphone system. And I've actually found that it's been harder and harder to get good performance out of a system, which is why I want to make this video. And I feel like I'm actually pretty qualified to talk about this because I'm also an electrical engineer in addition to being a DJ, and I'm actually a PhD candidate in electrical engineering. So I do a lot of this wireless stuff kind of on a more daily basis, but I want to keep this about as least technical as I can while still making sure you guys understand kind of the basics of how wireless works and how to get better performance out of your system. Before we get started, I want to first thank DJ Dave Productions in Houston, Texas for teaching me pretty much everything I know about DJing. And also DJ Ivan, also in Houston, Texas, for putting this on and encouraging me to sort of make this video and presentation for other DJs. We were going to try to host this as sort of an in-person seminar, but due to the coronavirus and everything, it's been really hard to do so I just figured I'd record a video. So after recording this video, I actually realized that this video is really long, so I want to break it up into multiple parts. That way you guys can sort of pick which part is the most interesting and not have to watch the whole thing. So in this part, I want to just start out by talking about how wireless works and the basics of wireless. If you're not interested in this at all and you simply want to just dive right into improving your system or getting a new system, I have separate videos on that, so look for parts 2 and 3. Otherwise, stick around and I'll be talking about just sort of the basics of wireless and wireless transmission and how these things actually work. And this is really good terminology, so I do recommend watching it unless you already know most of this stuff, in which case, feel free to skip ahead. So the wireless we think of when we actually think of sending a wireless signal, like a wireless audio signal, is actually a wave. And as DJs, we actually know all about waves because sound is a wave. So with that being said, sound and sort of what are called radio waves or electromagnetic waves are completely different types of waves. And it's important to know the difference because as DJs, we may understand how sound works and how sound waves work, but radio waves behave differently in certain circumstances, and sometimes the intuition we have about sound waves doesn't directly apply to radio waves. So sound is what's called a longitudinal wave, which basically means that if we consider this to be what the speaker's actually doing, so let's say this is the speaker cone, it's pushing forward, and then as it reaches here, there's a sort of the neutral zone or zero crossing, and then it sort of pushes back behind the speaker. This is moving kind of back, and you kind of get these different regions of what are called compression and rarefaction. So as the wave sort of travels along this, along air or along this media, we're seeing these areas of sort of compression and rarefaction, and kind of the rate at which these are happening determines the frequency of the sound. Now, electromagnetic radiation, or often shorted to radio waves on the other hand, or EM waves, are kind of completely different. So radio waves are transverse waves, which basically mean energy is going to travel across a wave rather than along it. So unlike sound, which requires a medium such as air, radio waves don't. This is why we use EM waves to send wireless audio signals and then eventually sort of turn them back into audio signals at the end of the process. EM waves are also the same. This is sort of the same radio waves that carry color, that carry radio, TV, pretty much Wi-Fi, anything that uses when we consider wireless. They're all EM waves and they're all the same type of wave. And basically the thing that differentiates them, just like the thing that basically differentiates most sounds from each other, is the frequency of the wave. So kind of get an idea of how EM waves work, just like sound, they get smaller or softer with distance. So think about standing, 1 foot away from a speaker versus 50 feet away. It's going to be a lot quieter. Same thing with a radio wave. If you're standing, 1 foot away from where let's say the transmitter is outputting the wave, it's going to be received at a much higher amplitude than if you're 50 feet away in the same way. And yeah, once again, we use EM waves to send this audio. And the reason we do that is it's faster to send EM waves. They travel a lot faster. You can send them for longer distances than sound because it doesn't have the same drop off as sound does. And it also requires less energy. So you think about sending an audio signal, 200 feet away and making sure it's clear and heard clearly. You're going to need these speakers that are going to be running on these, 2,000 watt amplifiers. And yeah, they're not drawing 2,000 watts the whole time, but you're still having to draw a lot of power. Whereas with EM waves, your receiver and transmitter can often operate, and usually does, on like AA batteries or a simple, DC, 5 volts or something like that. So those are kind of the main reasons why we don't use the audio waves to send audio itself wirelessly. So to get an idea of how how these differences look visually, kind of as we saw before with the longitudinal wave, we have these areas of compression and rarefaction as the speaker cone is moving in and out. And sort of notice how the energy itself is traveling across the wave, because we have areas where the air molecules are bunched up together and areas where they're sort of spaced out apart, and eventually it's received by the ear. Whereas with electromagnetic waves, these are transverse waves. So notice how this is an example of light, but the same can be said about any other sort of EM wave that's being sent wirelessly. The actual signal is being sent sort of across the wave, not along it. It's being kind of sent almost perpendicular to it. And as a result, this wave travels pretty much instantaneously fast because it doesn't require a medium. So whereas this longitudinal wave travels at the speed of sound because of the air molecules you're sending across, the transverse waves actually travel at the speed of light, which is much, much, much faster. So taking a closer look at sort of the EM spectrum, and this is very similar to an audio spectrum where we have our low frequencies with the bass, the high frequencies with our vocals and other things. This is the same sort of idea of a frequency spectrum, but this is for EM waves. And if you notice here, the higher and higher frequency we have for EM waves, we end up getting into visible light. So when we're considering wireless microphones and wireless systems, generally we're going to be sending it in these pretty extremely low frequency ranges. And we're usually sending them in the sort of 500 to 600 megahertz range. So this is about the same frequency that most TV stations transmit at. And occasionally you'll have some that operate at 2.4 or 5 gigahertz in the Wi-Fi band. And I'll talk a little bit more later about why I don't recommend Wi-Fi microphones, but those exist as well. So to go in a little bit more detail about the electromagnetic spectrum, basically EM waves have frequency just like sound waves do. And just like sound sources, if you have two EM waves at the same frequency, transmitting at the same frequencies, you can actually interfere with each other, and it can be hard to sort of unseparate them once they've been interfered with each other. So if you think about it as a DJ, let's say you're mixing two tracks together, both of the tracks had vocals, it's going to sound like a train wreck if they're both playing at the same time, and you're not sort of doing anything to sort of mitigate the fact that these are occupying the same frequency space. It can be hard to sort of understand what each person's saying and separate what the two songs are kind of sonically. In the same way, if you're sending two EM waves that are occupying the same frequencies, you're going to have this similar issue of it being hard to sort of differentiate them. So in order for interference to occur, this is kind of a key principle, the frequencies themselves must overlap in some way. And basically the easiest thing to do, like when you're mixing two tracks together by, let's say you pull the bass out of the track you're mixing in so that, the bass frequencies aren't overlapping, and you mix it at a certain point where there aren't vocals, and then let's say you mix in the bass and slowly fade out the other track. In the same way, we want to be able to send our signal in the electromagnetic spectrum in a way that it's not interfering with other signals and other signals aren't interfering with us. So this is actually a property of all waves, this idea that different frequencies don't interfere with each other, but I'm waving my hands a little bit because there's kind of a mathematical reason behind this that I don't want to get into too much detail on. So now what I want to do is talk about how this EM sort of idea incorporates into an actual physical wireless microphone system. So let's say with basically the general idea behind a wireless mic system is we start with, let's say, a vocalist or some sound that we want to record. Now this sound is in air pressure terms, and this is from 20 hertz to 20 kilohertz. So this is this longitudinal wave we've talked about that we're all familiar with, and we now want to send this wirelessly. So the first thing we need to do is actually convert this acoustic energy into electrical energy. And the way we do that is with just a plain old microphone. Now this is not necessarily a wireless microphone, this is just your standard microphone. And what the microphone does is it turns the acoustic energy from the air into electrical energy that can then be sent to a speaker or amplifier. Then is what we do is we send this electrical energy that the microphone is outputting into what's called a transmitter. And the transmitter basically takes this electrical energy that the microphone puts out and turns it into a radio wave. And I like using this picture because this is a Sennheiser microphone, and this is a Sennheiser SKP500, which has an XLR female connector, and you can actually plug this on any wired microphone and turn it into a wireless microphone. So I like this analogy because here you can clearly see the difference between kind of where the microphone ends and the transmitter begins. Once the transmitter has turned this electrical energy into an EM wave, it then sort of sends it wirelessly by modulating the signal, and that signal is sent across a channel, which basically the idea is the channel, nothing good ever happens in the channel. And you're sending this over distance, you're gonna be picking up interference, just because that's how things work, and there's gonna be noise and all sorts of other issues. And eventually this is received by what's called a receiver, which takes this radio wave and converts it back from this EM wave back into electrical energy that's at the audio spectrum. And then this electrical energy is plugged into a speaker, or then a mixing board, which is then plugged into a speaker. And the speaker turns this electrical energy that's outputted by the receiver into acoustic energy, and using just kind of, that's how speakers work. So if you think about kind of what's going on here, this is the main system that we're replacing a normal audio cable with, because we could have just plugged an XLR cable directly from the microphone into the speaker. But instead is what we're doing is we're using a transmitter and receiver so that we don't need to use an audio signal. And one thing that's really important is that the transmitter and receiver both are tuned to a certain frequency, and it's important that they're both tuned to the same frequency. And I'll explain why that's the case in just a minute. So the next question or the important question we need to ask is, how do we send a signal across the channel? And the way we do this is we modulate it in such a way that reduces the chance it's going to be interfered with. And I like to use an analogy here that is sort of like people talking. So let's say you're in a room and everybody's talking about different things, and there's a specific conversation that you want to hear. Now, there are ways you could, for instance, walk yourself closer to the person that you're wanting to hear, but you're going to have to find them and you're going to have to listen to them. And if there are other people talking at the same time, it can be hard to sort of decipher what they're saying while everything else is going on. So instead, why don't we put everyone who's talking into their own separate rooms that are kind of talking about different things, and that way the sound doesn't interfere with each other, and you can just choose to go into a room if you want to hear what a certain person is talking and you don't want to hear what anyone else is talking. And that's really the general idea behind modulation, is basically we're taking in this electrical or audio signal from 20 hertz to 20 kilohertz and carrying it at a higher frequency, because there are likely a lot of audio signals that we're wanting to send at the same time. Maybe we don't care about them, but let's say the TV stations, there are 1,000 channels out there that they're trying to send, and we don't want to be picking up all those 1,000 channels at the same time. So that's the idea behind modulation. We want to send this signal in a specific room so that when we receive the signal, we're only getting that signal and we're not getting anything else. And the frequency that we're actually modulating it by is called the carrier frequency. And the reason we call it that is this frequency, and this is the sort of frequency or the number that you see on your receiver and transmitter, is the frequency that we're carrying it at when we're sending it across the channel. So this kind of brings up an interesting question. Well, can I just slightly adjust the carrier frequency? Like if I'm sending it at 500 hertz, shouldn't a carrier frequency at 500.1 hertz not interfere with the carrier frequency at 500 hertz? I mean, after all, they're different frequencies. That's technically true, and that's exactly right. Two frequencies don't interfere with each other. The issue comes because we're not just sending the carrier frequency. We're using the carrier frequency to carry an audio signal that has some bandwidth that's maybe 20 kilohertz or maybe even larger. So we're actually having the entire audio signal, or the entire audio spectrum perhaps, riding along this carrier frequency. So the entire frequency range isn't just this 500 hertz that you're sending it at. It's actually 500 hertz plus or minus some range that corresponds to the audio signal that you're sending. So basically, there are a lot more frequencies present when you're sending a wireless signal than just the carrier frequency. In fact, often this is around 200 kilohertz, and that's even though the audio signal we're sending is only maybe 20 kilohertz because you're going from 20 hertz to 20 kilohertz, you're actually sending it over a range of 200 kilohertz because by spacing it out, you can kind of get better performance. So that's just something important to realize, is that you can't just tune your receiver slightly and expect there not to be any interference. These things will still overlap if any part of the spectrum overlaps with any part of the spectrum of another signal you're sending. So now I want to talk a little bit about different types of modulation, and I don't want to get too technical here, but it's important to understand how these types of modulation work in order to understand how to get better performance out of your system and why you're experiencing dropouts or anything like that. First type of modulation I want to talk about is this analog category. So there are two main categories. There's analog transmission and digital transmission. And analog transmission is a little bit more simple to understand because we're sending the signal directly across the spectrum. And of course it's modulated, but it's actually being sent as a signal as itself. And the two main types of analog transmission that we see are amplitude modulation, or AM, which is the same scheme used in AM radio. And this is easy to understand, but the performance is pretty bad. And the other type of analog transmission is frequency modulation, or FM, which is quite a bit harder to understand, but it gives better performance than AM in a lot of cases. And frequency modulation is used in most wireless microphone systems. We'll use AM to sort of understand how modulation works, but kind of with the caveat that FM is more the scheme that's most popular and how you're going to kind of see these microphones working. On the other hand, you have digital transmission, which rather than sending the signal directly, it turns your signal into a series of bits or some sort of code, and then sends this digital code by encoding it and sends those bits across the channel, which are then decoded and unscrambled back into an audio signal. Now, in theory, you're going to get the best theoretical performance with digital transmission. And the reason is because you're not sending the analog signal directly, you're sending a code, you can very easily add redundancies in this code so that you can correct any errors that could occur in the channel. Basically, you can add bits that, let's say, well, if they don't all add up to this number, then you know an error has occurred, and you can sort of not only recognize that an error occurred and request that information again, but you can actually correct the error with enough information. So kind of interesting, kind of cool. Digital transmission in theory is the best, but most wireless microphone systems are still analog, and that doesn't necessarily mean that the system you should buy is digital. And so we'll just talk about digital from a very high level in general, kind of how it works and how it's different than analog, but not going to get too much into detail. Basically, to talk about how analog transmission, kind of moving back there, how an AM system works, is let's say we take an audio signal or an electrical audio signal that's 20 hertz to 20 kilohertz. So this is 20 kilohertz. Basically, what we do is we ride the signal at a carrier frequency. And what this ends up doing is picking up the signal and modulating it so that it takes up a different range. And if you think about another audio signal here, we could use another carrier frequency and another transmitter to send it at a different frequency. So notice how these frequencies, if I send another signal here and another here, don't overlap with each other, and that's how we avoid getting interference. Now, some of you may be looking and being like, well, what's this minus 20 kilohertz? And these are actually negative frequencies, and they do exist, but they basically behave pretty much the same as positive frequencies for all the cases we care about, so don't really worry about it too much. So once the signal is modulated, this is what's actually sent out by the transmitter, and this is what's received by the receiver. Basically, you tune the transmitter to this carrier frequency, and it is able to internally send the signal by modulating it at that frequency. Then you got to tune the receiver to the same carrier frequency that you tune the transmitter to. So when it receives a signal, it knows which part of the spectrum to pick up and put back at baseband so that it can be demodulated and turned into an electrical signal that can then be, sent to a speaker or something like that. So the idea of picking up the signal and sending it in this frequency is called modulation, and then picking it back up and putting it back at baseband, back to where it originally was, is called demodulation. So in this plot is what I want to show is kind of the differences between amplitude modulation and frequency modulation, and why FM is better in a lot of cases. So with amplitude modulation, if we think about what's going on here in this plot, this here is how clean the signal is. So on this end of the line, we're going to have like really poor signal quality. So maybe the distance is from the transmitter to the receiver is really high. There's a lot of other sort of interference and noise in the channel. Whereas over here, we're close from the transmitter to the receiver. There's not a lot of interference and not a lot of noise. And over here is what the quality of the output signal is. So the thing about this is, how does it sound? Does it sound good or bad? So with amplitude modulation, notice if we're sending a clean signal, we actually receive a pretty clean signal. And if we're sending a bad signal, we're kind of receiving a bad signal. And notice how this is a pretty straight line. So it's basically like as the channel gets cleaner and cleaner and cleaner, it's going to sound better and better and better. Now with FM, we kind of have a similar plot, except notice how the receive quality is much, much better than AM, kind of at a given point, at least here. So basically what this is saying is that if the channel isn't interfering with the signal too much, we're going to get a much better improvement by using an FM scheme. Then what happens is, as more and more issues happen in the channel, as let's say the distance increases, there's more interference and more noise, what ends up happening is FM has this really steep drop off, and it even gets worse than AM after a certain point. And this point where this ends up starting to happen is called the FM knee, because you notice this is sort of like a knee where it bends and then it kind of goes really crappy really quickly. And this is what happens when you end up getting dropouts in your wireless microphone system that's using an FM transmission scheme. So what's happening is you're sending a signal, and let's say it's sounding pretty good and you're pretty intelligible, and then somebody walks between the receiver or transmitter, or some other signal kind of ends up sort of interfering with it, and you see the boom, this dropout. This is where you get static, or where you get just the signal just dying completely for a second, and then it kind of the receive signal kind of ends up jumping back up and it sounds better. So this is important to see, because as long as you're operating in a relatively clean channel, FM is going to give you a bigger improvement. Now with digital cases, if we think about kind of what's going on, FM has better resistance to noise than AM, but comparing that to digital, it can be really tricky, because digital is kind of completely different altogether. And there are a lot of parameters that go into creating a digital system that can make a digital system better or worse. But I do want to say, in theory, digital should have better performance even than FM under certain circumstances. So, of course, it can offer improved performance, and it can also offer error correction, which basically, as we talked about earlier, can find errors and correct them automatically so that the receive signal kind of always stays good, no matter what. And the other thing, if you're trying to do any sort of encryption, if you're trying to send some sensitive data wirelessly or something like that, digital is the way to go, because with an analog scheme, yeah, there might be some way to scramble it, but of course there's some way that there's a possibility someone could unscramble it. Whereas with digital, you can send it in a way that it would take somebody, a million years to be able to unscramble it, unless they are you and you're the one decoding it. The problem with digital modulation is at high noise levels, it's even worse than FM. So if you think about kind of the way these curves work, you have AM that's sort of pretty straight. You have FM that has this knee. Digital is like better than FM potentially, and then it has an even steeper knee, sorry. But of course, the data rate of this can often be adjusted so that you don't have to deal with this issue, or you can kind of operate it in a range so that this doesn't happen. So this isn't necessarily always the case. It's just kind of, in general, this painting with a broad stroke idea of how digital performs. You also can have extra error, unfortunately, due to amplitude quantization and due to sort of sampling, although with the sampling error kind of goes away, but quantization is likely not going to be noticeable, but that's kind of another issue that a digital scheme has. And it's kind of the difference between listening to a CD and like a vinyl, where vinyl is kind of this analog scheme and a CD is a digital scheme. And the other thing that I will say, another con of the digital modulation scheme, is you kind of have more things that can go wrong. Because not only are you transmitting the signal and modulating it, you're transmitting a code, you're creating a code and sending the code, and then you have to take the code and receive it. So ideally, you have a good quality transmitter and receiver if you're going the digital route, to where you don't even have to worry about this. But it is worth mentioning that there's kind of more things in the system, and it can be harder to debug a digital system because there are a lot more pieces to the puzzle. Whereas with analog, you're kind of just modulating it and sending it, as opposed to having to create a code and having to do all this error correction and things like that. Now, all things being equal, if I was going to be making or buying a mic, it would be digital, just kind of everything else is equal, because I know that digital can give better performance. But unfortunately, based on how the real world works and what people buy, most mics that people buy are analog. And I've actually had the best performance in the field in my DJing events using analog mics, and those are the only ones that I mainly use. So go figure. So here's another plot. Just really want to talk about what's going on. If we consider this to be sort of analog FM and kind of what's going on, this is sort of your FM knee here actually. And notice how as your signal gets poorer and poorer quality, the signal strength gets lower, the audio quality goes down. And with digital, it can kind of hold out a little bit more. So here's you see that better noise sort of resistance. And then it drops off even quicker than FM, to the point that if it's like really low, FM is going to be slightly better than digital, and AM would probably be even better than FM. But of course, it's worth saying, if you're operating at that low of a level, all of these schemes are going to be really poor. So what really is important is optimizing the system that you have. All right, thank you guys so much for watching, and I'll see you guys in the next video where we talk about optimizing the current system that you have, and then I'll be making a third part that talks about sort of what to look for when you're buying a new wireless microphone system. So I hope you guys are enjoying this so far, and feel free to leave me a question if you have any questions in the comments, and I'll do my best to respond. Thanks.